The Earth once entered a time of endless storms when the skies seemed to pour without rest. This dramatic period is the Carnian Pluvial Event. For about 2 million years, heavy rains transformed the planet, turning dry, dusty lands into vast wetlands filled with rivers and thick forests. Life was forced to change and adapt in surprising ways. New plants spread quickly, and early reptiles began to rise in importance. This was far more than a simple change in weather. It reshaped the future of life on Earth. From these relentless rains came the first steps toward the age of the dinosaurs, setting the stage for a new world to emerge. The Carnian Pluvial Event was a major period of environmental change that took place around 234 million years ago, during the time known as the Late Triassic. It lasted for roughly 2 million years and is remembered as a time when Earth experienced unusually heavy and persistent rainfall across large parts of the planet. This was not just a simple change in weather, it was a deep and lasting shift in climate that affected land, oceans, and living organisms in powerful ways. Before this event began, Earth's climate was mostly hot and dry. Much of the land was joined together in one massive supercontinent called Pangaea. Because of its enormous size, large areas of this landmass were far from the cooling effects of the oceans. As a result, many regions were dry, with deserts stretching across wide distances. Rainfall was limited in many places, and plant life had to survive in tough, water-scarce conditions. Rivers were often seasonal, and ecosystems were adapted to long, dry periods. Then something changed. Over time, the climate began to shift in a dramatic way. Rainfall increased across many regions, and areas that had once been dry started to receive steady and heavy rain. This shift marked the beginning of the Carnian Pluvial Event. The word pluvial simply means rain-related, and in this case, it refers to a long-lasting period of wetter conditions than usual. Scientists believe that this was not just a regional event, but a global one, affecting different parts of the planet in different ways, but with a shared pattern of increased moisture. One of the main causes of this dramatic shift is believed to be massive volcanic activity linked to the Wrangellia. This was a huge region of volcanic eruptions that released enormous amounts of gases into the atmosphere. Among these gases was carbon dioxide, which is known to trap heat and affect global temperatures. As these gases built up in the atmosphere, they likely caused warming, which in turn affected ocean currents and the movement of air around the planet. Warmer air can hold more moisture, and this may have led to the increased rainfall that defined the Carnian Pluvial Event. As rainfall patterns changed, the environment began to transform. Dry landscapes slowly turned greener. Rivers became more active and permanent, carving through the land and carrying sediments across vast distances. Lakes expanded, and wetlands became more common. In many regions, this meant that plant life could grow more easily and spread into areas that had once been too dry to support it. Forests began to expand and new types of plants started to appear and thrive. This change in plant life had a direct impact on animals. Herbivores, which depend on plants for food, found new opportunities as vegetation became more abundant. As these plant-eating animals increased in number and diversity, so did the predators that hunted them. This period of change is closely linked to the early rise and spread of dinosaurs, which would later become some of the most dominant animals on Earth. While dinosaurs had already appeared before this event, the environmental changes during the Carnian Pluvial Event may have helped them expand and diversify in important ways. The oceans were also affected. Increased rainfall led to more water flowing from land into the seas, carrying nutrients with it. This could have caused changes in marine ecosystems, including the growth of new types of plankton. These tiny organisms form the base of ocean food chains, so changes at this level can affect many other forms of marine life. At the same time, volcanic activity and climate change may have caused stress for some species, leading to extinctions in both marine and land environments. Because of these combined effects, the Carnian Pluvial Event is often seen as a key moment of both crisis and opportunity in Earth's history. Some species struggled to survive the rapid changes and disappeared, while others adapted and thrived. This pattern of loss and renewal is a common theme in Earth's past, but the Carnian Pluvial Event stands out because of its scale and its long-lasting impact. Another important aspect of this event is how it helped shape the future of ecosystems. The spread of forests and more complex plant life created new habitats. These habitats supported a wider range of animals, leading to increased biodiversity. Over time, This helped set the stage for the development of more advanced ecosystems, including those that would later be dominated by dinosaurs during the Jurassic period. Scientists study the Carnian Pluvial Event using different kinds of evidence. They look at rock layers, fossils, and chemical signatures preserved in ancient materials. Changes in sediment patterns can show shifts in rainfall and river activity. Fossils reveal how plant and animal life changed over time. Chemical clues, such as variations in carbon isotopes, can point to changes in the atmosphere and volcanic activity. By putting all of this evidence together, scientists can build a clearer picture of what happened during this important period. The late Triassic world was a place that felt both familiar and completely strange at the same time. If you could stand on the surface of the Earth during this period, you would recognize mountains, rivers, oceans, and skies, but almost everything else would seem different in subtle and surprising ways. The continents were not scattered across the globe as they are today. Instead, nearly all of Earth's land was joined together in a single massive supercontinent known as Pangaea. This enormous landmass stretched across much of the planet, forming a giant uneven shape that dominated the globe from one side to the other. Around it lay a vast global ocean, wide and deep, wrapping around the edges of the land like a single endless sea. Because all the continents were connected, there were no large oceans breaking up the land in the middle, and this had a powerful effect on climate. Areas far from the coastline were extremely dry. Without nearby oceans to bring moisture, these regions became vast deserts that stretched for thousands of kilometers. The air in these inland regions was often hot and dry, with little rainfall and strong seasonal changes. In contrast, areas closer to the coasts experienced more moderate conditions, where the presence of the ocean helped soften temperatures and bring in some moisture. The late Triassic climate was generally warmer than today. There were no large ice caps at the poles, and the temperature difference between the equator and the poles was much smaller than it is now. This meant that even polar regions were relatively mild, with no permanent snow or ice. The warmth spread across the planet, creating conditions that allowed life to exist in places that would be too cold today. However, the warmth did not mean comfort. Much of the land was harsh and unforgiving. The large interior of Pangaea experienced extreme heat during the day and cooler temperatures at night. Rainfall was often seasonal and unpredictable. In some places, long dry periods were suddenly broken by intense rains that could cause flooding. These dramatic shifts in weather created a world that was constantly changing, where survival depended on adaptability. One of the most important features of the late Triassic climate was the presence of strong monsoon systems. Because of the size of Pangaea, the land heated up and cooled down much faster than the surrounding ocean. This difference in temperature created powerful winds that shifted direction with the seasons. During certain times of the year, moist air from the ocean would be pulled inland, bringing heavy rains. At other times, dry air would flow outward, leading to drought conditions. These seasonal patterns shaped ecosystems and influenced where different plants and animals could live. The landscapes of the late Triassic were incredibly varied. There were vast deserts covered in sand dunes, rocky plateaus, and dry riverbeds that only filled with water during rare storms. There were also regions with rivers and lakes, where water supported more abundant life. In some areas, forests grew along riverbanks, and in regions where rainfall was more reliable. These forests were very different from modern forests. Instead of flowering plants, which had not yet evolved, the dominant vegetation included conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and ferns. Conifers were among the most important plants of this time. They were well adapted to dry conditions, with needle-like leaves that reduced water loss. Many of these plants looked somewhat like modern pine trees, although they were often different in detail. Cycads, on the other hand, resembled palm trees, but were not closely related to them. They had thick trunks and large, stiff leaves that formed a crown at the top. Ginkgos, which still exist today in a single surviving species, were more common and diverse during the late Triassic. Ferns, which reproduce using spores rather than seeds, covered the ground in many areas, especially in regions with more moisture. Together, these plants formed ecosystems that supported a wide range of animals. The late Triassic was a time of transition and experimentation in the history of life. Many groups that had dominated earlier periods were still present, but new groups were beginning to rise and change the balance of power on land and in the seas. On land, reptiles were the dominant animals. The age of mammals had not yet truly begun, although small, early relatives of mammals were already present. These early mammal-like creatures were generally small, often no larger than a rat or a small dog. They lived in the shadows of larger animals, likely feeding on insects and other small prey. They were active, warm-blooded, and covered in fur, but they did not yet dominate the land. The most important group of reptiles during the late Triassic were the archosaurs. This group included a wide variety of animals, some of which would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodiles, and flying reptiles. At this stage, the archosaurs were already diverse, filling many different ecological roles. Some were large predators, others were plant eaters, and still others were small, agile creatures that moved quickly through their environments. Among these archosaurs were the early dinosaurs. In the beginning, dinosaurs were not the dominant animals they would later become. They were just one group among many, and in many places they were relatively rare. Early dinosaurs were generally small to medium in size, with upright limbs that allowed them to move efficiently. This posture gave them an advantage over other reptiles that sprawled with their limbs to the side. Over time, this advantage would become more important, but during the late Triassic, dinosaurs were still in the process of establishing themselves. Alongside the dinosaurs were other archosaurs that were often larger and more dominant. Some of these were powerful predators with long bodies, strong jaws, and sharp teeth. Others were armored plant eaters, protected by thick plates or spikes. These animals filled many of the roles that dinosaurs would later take over, and in many ecosystems, they were the top species. One of the most fascinating groups of late Triassic animals were the flying reptiles, known as pterosaurs. These were the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight. Their wings were made of skin stretched over elongated fingers, and they likely had light, hollow bones to help them stay airborne. Early pterosaurs were relatively small, but they were already skilled flyers, capable of gliding and flapping through the air in search of food. They likely fed on insects, small animals, and possibly fish. The seas of the late Triassic were just as rich and varied as the land. Marine life had recovered from earlier mass extinctions and was diversifying once again. The oceans were filled with different types of reptiles, many of which had adapted to life in the water in remarkable ways. Some resembled modern dolphins in shape, with streamlined bodies and fins for swimming. These were fast and efficient predators, chasing down fish and other prey in the open ocean. Other marine reptiles had long necks and small heads, allowing them to sneak up on prey or search for food in tight spaces. There were also heavily built species with strong jaws, capable of crushing shells or tackling larger prey. These reptiles occupied many different ecological niches, from shallow coastal waters to deeper ocean environments. Fish were also abundant in the late Triassic seas, including both bony fish and cartilaginous fish like sharks. Coral reefs, although different from modern reefs, provided important habitats for many marine species. Invertebrates such as mollusks were common, including ammonites, which had coiled shells and were among the most recognizable marine fossils from this time. These creatures drifted through the water or swam slowly, forming an important part of the food chain. The late Triassic was also a time of ongoing change beneath the surface of the Earth. The supercontinent Pangaea was beginning to break apart. Deep within the planet, forces were slowly pulling the landmass apart, creating cracks and rifts that would eventually lead to the formation of new oceans. At first, these changes were subtle. Long valleys formed where the crust was being stretched, and volcanic activity increased in these regions. Over time, these rifts would widen and fill with water, but during the late Triassic, the process was still in its early stages. Volcanic activity played an important role in shaping the environment. In some regions, large eruptions released vast amounts of lava and gases into the atmosphere. These events could have local and even global effects, influencing climate and ecosystems. Although the most dramatic volcanic events would come later, the late Triassic already showed signs of the powerful forces that were at work within the Earth. The combination of continental layout, climate, and life forms made the late Triassic a unique period in Earth's history. It was a world of extremes, where deserts and forests existed side by side, where ancient groups of animals competed with emerging ones, and where the planet itself was beginning to change in fundamental ways. Life during this time was constantly adapting. Plants evolved to survive in dry conditions, developing features that helped them conserve water and reproduce efficiently. Animals evolved new ways of moving, feeding, and interacting with their environment. Predators became faster and more specialized, while prey developed defenses such as speed, armor, or camouflage. The interactions between different species created complex ecosystems. In a river valley, for example, you might find dense vegetation supporting herbivorous animals, which in turn attracted predators. In a desert region, life would be more sparse, with animals adapted to survive on limited water and food. Before the long period of intense rainfall known as the Carnian Pluvial Event began, the world looked very different, yet in some ways it was already preparing for change. Life on Earth during this time in the late Triassic period was shaped by a combination of heat, dryness, and vast open landscapes. The continents were joined together into one enormous landmass called Pangaea, stretching across much of the planet. This supercontinent created extreme environmental conditions. Because the land was so large and continuous, many regions were far from the cooling influence of the oceans. As a result, large parts of the interior were hot, dry, and often harsh. The climate before the rains was mostly arid, meaning that it was dry for long periods. Rainfall was limited and often seasonal. Instead of steady, reliable rain, many areas experienced brief but intense storms followed by long stretches of dryness. Rivers could appear suddenly during storms and then disappear again, leaving behind dry channels and cracked ground. Lakes would shrink or vanish entirely during dry seasons. In such an environment, only certain types of plants and animals could survive, and they had to be well adapted to these conditions. The landscapes themselves reflected this dryness. Vast deserts spread across large portions of Pangaea, with sand dunes shifting under strong winds. Rocky plains and scrublands were common, dotted with hardy vegetation that could tolerate heat and lack of water. In some regions, there were seasonal floodplains where water would briefly collect during rains, allowing life to flourish for a short time before drying out again. Coastal areas and regions closer to the edges of the continent had somewhat milder conditions, with more consistent moisture, but even these places were not as lush as later environments would become. Plants during this time were very different from the flowering plants that dominate the modern world. There were no grasses, no flowers, and no fruit-bearing trees as we know them today. Instead, the plant world was dominated by more ancient groups. Conifers were among the most important plants, forming forests in areas where conditions allowed. These early conifers were similar in some ways to modern pine trees, with needle-like leaves that helped reduce water loss. This feature was especially important in dry climates, where conserving moisture could mean the difference between survival and death. Alongside conifers were cycads, which looked somewhat like a mix between palm trees and ferns. They had thick trunks and large, stiff leaves that spread out in a crown at the top. Cycads were well suited to warm climates and could survive in relatively poor soils. They were common across many parts of Pangaea and played an important role in the ecosystems of the time. Another major group of plants was the ginkgophytes, relatives of the modern ginkgo tree. These plants had fan-shaped leaves and were able to tolerate a range of conditions, including dryness and seasonal changes. Ferns were also widespread, especially in areas that received more moisture. They often grew in shaded or damp environments, such as near rivers or in low-lying regions where water could collect. Horsetails, another ancient group of plants, thrived in wet or seasonally wet areas. They had hollow, jointed stems and could grow quickly when water was available. However, their presence was limited in the driest regions, where they could not survive without regular moisture. The plant life of this time was adapted to a world of extremes. Many plants had features that helped them conserve water, such as thick leaves, waxy coatings, or deep root systems. Growth often depended on the seasons. During wetter periods, plants would grow rapidly, producing leaves and spores. During dry periods, they would slow down or enter a dormant state, conserving energy and resources until conditions improved. Animal life before the rains was just as fascinating and varied. This was a time when the first dinosaurs were beginning to appear, but they were not yet the dominant animals on land. Instead, the world was shared by a wide range of reptiles, including many groups that have no direct modern equivalents. Among the most important animals were the archosaurs, a group that included the ancestors of both dinosaurs and crocodiles. Some archosaurs were large and powerful predators, while others were smaller and more agile. These animals were well adapted to the warm climate and often had upright postures, which allowed them to move efficiently across land. Early dinosaurs were still relatively small and not yet as diverse as they would later become. They lived alongside many other reptiles and had to compete for food and space. Some of these early dinosaurs were meat eaters, hunting small animals, while others were plant eaters, feeding on the available vegetation. Their ability to move quickly and adapt to different environments would eventually help them rise to dominance, but at this stage, they were just one part of a much larger ecological picture. Synapsids, the group of animals that would eventually give rise to mammals, were also present. By this time, they were no longer the dominant land animals, as they had been in earlier periods. However, they still played important roles in ecosystems. Some were small and likely lived in burrows, helping them avoid the heat of the day and conserve moisture. These early mammal-like creatures were probably active during cooler times, such as at night or early morning. Large amphibians could be found in wetter areas, especially near rivers and lakes. These animals depended on water for reproduction and survival, so their distribution was closely tied to the availability of moisture. In dry periods, they may have retreated to remaining water sources or buried themselves in mud to wait for better conditions. Insects were abundant and played a crucial role in ecosystems. They helped break down plant material, recycle nutrients, and serve as food for many animals. Although there were no flowering plants yet, insects still interacted with vegetation in various ways, such as feeding on leaves or spreading spores. The ecosystems of this time were shaped by the constant challenge of water availability. In dry regions, life was sparse and scattered. Plants grew far apart, and animals had to travel long distances to find food and water. In more favorable areas, such as near rivers or along coastlines, ecosystems were richer and more complex. Here, plants could grow more densely, providing food and shelter for a wider range of animals. Food chains were relatively simple compared to later periods, but they were still dynamic. Plants formed the base of the system, capturing energy from the sun and turning it into food. Herbivores fed on these plants, and carnivores hunted the herbivores. Scavengers and decomposers broke down dead material, returning nutrients to the soil and allowing new plants to grow. The overall stability of these ecosystems depended on the balance between dry and wet periods. While conditions were generally harsh, life had adapted to survive within these limits. However, this balance was fragile. Even small changes in climate could have significant effects on the distribution of plants and animals. As time went on, subtle shifts began to occur. Volcanic activity increased in certain regions, releasing gases into the atmosphere. These gases could affect temperature and weather patterns, gradually altering the climate. Although these changes were not immediately obvious, they were setting the stage for a much larger transformation. Before the rains began, the world was a place of contrasts. Some regions were barren and dry, while others supported more life. The plants and animals that lived during this time were tough and adaptable, able to survive in conditions that would be challenging for many modern species. They had evolved strategies to deal with heat, drought, and uncertainty, and these strategies allowed them to thrive in a world that was constantly testing their limits. The coming of the Carnian Pluvial Event would change everything. The long period of dryness would give way to extended rainfall, transforming landscapes and ecosystems in ways that few could have predicted. Rivers would become more permanent, lakes would expand, and new types of vegetation would spread across the land. Animals would face new opportunities and new challenges, leading to shifts in dominance and the rise of new groups. But before all of that, there was this earlier world shaped by dryness and resilience. It was a world where life had learned to endure, to wait for the right moment, and to make the most of limited resources. Understanding this period helps us see just how dramatic the changes brought by the rains would be. In this dry and demanding environment, every drop of water mattered. Every patch of shade could mean survival. Plants and animals were locked in a constant struggle, not only with each other, but with the environment itself. 4S. The discovery of the event did not happen in a single moment, nor did it come from one dramatic breakthrough. Instead, it slowly emerged over many years, built piece by scientists who were studying rocks, fossils, and the deep history of the Earth. At first, the clues were scattered, hidden in layers of stone across different parts of the world. No one initially realized that these clues were all connected. But as more evidence was collected and compared, a remarkable picture began to form. A story of a time when the planet changed in a powerful and unusual way. Geology, the study of rocks and the Earth's structure, played a central role in uncovering this story. Scientists who study rocks often travel to remote and rugged places where ancient layers of the Earth are exposed at the surface. These layers, known as strata, are like pages in a history book. Each layer was formed at a different time, and by studying them carefully, scientists can learn what the Earth was like when that layer was created. At first, geologists were simply trying to understand the order of these layers. They wanted to know which layers were older and which were younger. Over time, they developed methods to date rocks, allowing them to place events in a timeline. Some of these methods relied on the natural decay of radioactive elements, while others used the presence of certain fossils that were known to belong to specific periods of time. As geologists studied rock layers from the late part of the Triassic period, they began to notice something unusual. In many different locations, layers that should have looked similar showed clear signs of change. Some layers were rich in certain types of minerals that suggested heavy rainfall. Others showed signs of erosion, as if water had been flowing strongly across the land. These observations alone were not enough to prove anything, but they raised questions. The real turning point came when scientists began to compare findings from different parts of the world. In places that were once far apart but are now understood to have been connected in ancient times, similar patterns appeared. Rocks from Europe, North America, Asia, and other regions showed evidence of the same kind of environmental shift. This was surprising because it suggested that whatever had happened was not a local event, but something much larger. Fossils added another important layer of evidence. Fossils are the preserved remains or traces of ancient life, and they provide a direct link to the organisms that lived long ago. Paleontologists, scientists who study fossils, had already been collecting and studying these remains for many years. They were familiar with the kinds of plants and animals that lived during the Triassic period, and they had built a picture of how life changed over time. But as more fossils were discovered and carefully dated, scientists began to notice patterns that did not fit the usual expectations. In some layers, there was a sudden increase in certain types of plant fossils, especially those that thrived in wet conditions. These plants were very different from those found in earlier layers, which suggested that the environment had changed from dry to much wetter conditions. At the same time, changes were seen in animal fossils. Some species that had been common in earlier layers became rare or disappeared altogether, while new species began to appear. This kind of shift in life is often a sign of environmental change. When conditions change quickly, some organisms struggle to survive, while others take advantage of the new environment and spread rapidly. One of the most important clues came from the study of fossilized pollen and spores. These tiny particles are produced by plants, and they can be preserved in large numbers in sedimentary rocks. Because different plants produce different types of pollen and spores, scientists can use them to identify what kinds of plants were present at a given time. When researchers examined pollen and spore samples from layers associated with the event, they found a clear pattern. There was a sharp increase in the types of pollen produced by plants that prefer wet environments. This suggested that rainfall had increased significantly during that time. In addition, the diversity of plant life changed, indicating that ecosystems were being reshaped. Geochemical evidence provided further support for these findings. By analyzing the chemical composition of rocks, scientists can learn about the conditions under which they formed. For example, certain isotopes, forms of elements with different atomic structures, can reveal information about temperature, rainfall, and even the composition of the atmosphere. In rocks from the time of the event, scientists found changes in carbon isotopes that suggested a disturbance in the global carbon cycle. This was a major clue because the carbon cycle is closely linked to climate. A disruption in this cycle can lead to changes in temperature and rainfall patterns. At the same time, evidence of increased volcanic activity was discovered. In several regions, layers of volcanic rock were found that dated to the same period. These rocks indicated that large-scale eruptions had occurred, releasing gases into the atmosphere. Some of these gases, such as carbon dioxide, are known to affect climate by trapping heat. The combination of volcanic activity and changes in the carbon cycle suggested a possible cause for the environmental changes seen in the geological and fossil records. Scientists began to propose that massive volcanic eruptions may have released large amounts of greenhouse gases, leading to global warming and changes in weather patterns. This, in turn, could have caused the increase in rainfall and the shifts in ecosystems. Another important piece of evidence came from sedimentology, the study of how sediments are deposited. In many locations, layers from the time of the event showed signs of rapid sediment deposition. This could happen when heavy rains cause rivers to flood and carry large amounts of material into lakes and oceans. The presence of such layers supported the idea that rainfall had increased significantly. In some places, coal deposits were found in layers from this period. Coal forms from the remains of plants that grow in wet, swampy environments. The presence of coal indicated that large areas of land had become much wetter than before, allowing dense vegetation to grow and eventually be buried and preserved. As all these pieces of evidence were brought together, a clearer picture began to emerge. Scientists realized that they were looking at a major climatic event that had affected the entire planet. It was not just a brief change, but something that lasted for a significant period of time, long enough to reshape ecosystems and influence the course of evolution. The process of discovery was not without challenges. One of the biggest difficulties was determining whether the changes seen in different regions were truly connected. Because the Earth's continents have moved over time, rocks that are now far apart may have been close together in the past. Understanding these movements required knowledge of plate tectonics, the theory that explains how the Earth's surface is divided into large moving plates. By reconstructing the positions of the continents during the Triassic period, scientists were able to show that many of the regions where evidence was found had once been part of a single supercontinent. This made it more likely that the changes observed were part of a global event rather than separate local occurrences. Another challenge was dating the rocks and fossils accurately. Small errors in dating could make it difficult to determine whether events happened at the same time. Over the years, improvements in dating techniques helped to reduce these uncertainties, allowing scientists to build a more precise timeline. Collaboration between different fields of science was also crucial. Geologists, paleontologists, geochemists, and climate scientists all contributed their expertise. By sharing data and ideas, they were able to test different hypotheses and refine their understanding of the event. As the evidence grew stronger, the idea of a major climatic event during the late Triassic became widely accepted. Scientists gave it a name and began to study it in more detail, trying to understand not only what happened, but also why it happened and what its consequences were. The name we use to refer to one of the most remarkable and transformative episodes in Earth's deep past, the Carnian Pluvial Event, has a history that reflects the evolution of scientific thinking and the careful work of geologists and paleontologists. The story of this name is not just about a label, it is also about how scientists gradually uncovered the profound changes that occurred on our planet during a specific period in the late Triassic era. To understand the origin of the term, we must first step back and consider the broader context of geological naming, scientific classification, and the ways in which the Earth's history is divided into recognizable chapters. The late Triassic period itself, which spans roughly from 237 million years ago to 201 million years ago, is an epoch marked by significant transitions. It was a time when the supercontinent Pangaea dominated the globe, stretching almost unbroken from the northern to the southern hemisphere, creating vast deserts and interior dry lands. At the same time, early dinosaurs were beginning to rise to prominence, and the oceans teemed with new and unusual forms of life. The Carnian Age, the interval within the late Triassic from approximately 233 million years ago to 223 million years ago, represents a particularly fascinating slice of this era. Scientists noticed that during this time, there were dramatic shifts in climate, ecosystems, and biodiversity. Rocks and sediments deposited from this age showed distinct signatures of increased rainfall, flooding, and environmental stress, which, in turn, coincided with bursts of evolution and diversification among both marine and terrestrial life forms. The term Carnian Pluvial Event first appeared in scientific literature as geologists and paleontologists tried to describe this remarkable interval of increased humidity and rainfall. The word Carnian itself comes from the regional and historical study of European rock sequences. In the 19th century, geologists working in the eastern Alps of what is now Austria and northern Italy identified rock layers that were distinct from the surrounding formations, both in their composition and the fossils they contained. These layers were named after the Carnic Alps, a mountain range on the border of Austria and Italy, because the best exposures of these rocks could be found there. The use of geographical features as the basis for naming rock layers was, and still is, a common practice in geology. It allows scientists to anchor their descriptions of time and events to real-world locations where evidence can be observed and studied directly. The second part of the name, pluvial event, conveys the central climatic feature that distinguishes this interval. The word pluvial comes from the Latin word pluvia, meaning rain. In this context, it refers to a time of unusually high rainfall. Scientists recognize that sediments deposited during this interval often showed evidence of increased water activity. River channels became wider and deeper, lakes and floodplains expanded, and soils indicate that moisture was far more abundant than in the periods immediately before or after. This evidence was supported by paleontological discoveries, such as plant fossils that preferred wet conditions, and chemical signatures in the rocks that suggest changes in weathering and erosion consistent with a wetter climate. The classification of the Carnian Pluvial Event as a distinct geological and climatic phenomenon required careful analysis of rocks, fossils, and geochemical data. Scientists observed that certain isotopes, particularly carbon isotopes, displayed sharp shifts in their ratios during the Carnian. These shifts imply changes in the carbon cycle, likely linked to both volcanic activity and the alteration of ecosystems due to the changing climate. By examining sedimentary sequences around the world, researchers realized that this was not just a local or regional phenomenon but a global event, with effects detectable on multiple continents from Europe to North and South America and even in the oceans, as indicated by changes in marine fossils and sediments. The identification of the Carnian Pluvial Event as a global occurrence reinforced the need for a distinct name and classification, emphasizing that this was a unique interval in Earth's history, characterized by widespread environmental and biological change. The journey to the formal adoption of the term Carnian Pluvial Event also reflects the development of stratigraphy, the branch of geology that focuses on studying rock layers and their relative positions in time. Stratigraphy is not only about measuring the thickness of rocks or noting their composition, it is also about correlating layers across vast distances, identifying the sequence of events that the rocks record, and linking these sequences to changes in the environment and life on Earth. Early stratigraphers in the mid-20th century observed anomalous layers within Carnian Age rocks, often sandwiched between otherwise dry, desert-like sediments. These anomalous layers were marked by clay-rich deposits, coal seams, and fossil plants that indicated wetter conditions. Such observations hinted at a climatic episode that interrupted the general aridity of Pangaea's interior, but at first there was no unified term to describe it. Different researchers referred to it in various ways, sometimes calling it a humid interval or pluvial phase, depending on the local evidence they were studying. The challenge was to synthesize these disparate observations into a coherent global framework. As research continued, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, scientists increasingly recognized the significance of this interval for understanding patterns of evolution and extinction. Fossil evidence shows that the Carnian Pluvial Event coincided with the rise of several modern groups of animals and plants. In the oceans, new types of ammonites and bivalves proliferated. On land, dinosaurs began to diversify more widely, while other reptiles and amphibians experienced both extinctions and expansions in different regions. The vegetation transformed as well, with wet-loving ferns and seed plants spreading into areas that had previously been dominated by drought-tolerant gymnosperms. These biological shifts, combined with the sedimentological and geochemical evidence, underscored that the increased rainfall was not just a minor climatic fluctuation, but a major turning point in Earth's history. The need for a precise, widely recognized term became increasingly urgent. The formalization of the name Carnian Pluvial Event emerged from careful scientific debate and publication. Papers published in the 1970s and 1980s gradually coalesced around the idea that this interval of increased rainfall should be treated as a distinct event with global significance. Researchers emphasized its timing within the Carnian stage of the late Triassic, its clear expression in the rock record, and its pronounced impact on ecosystems. By the late 20th century, the term had become standard in the geological literature, appearing in journals, textbooks, and conference discussions. It provided a convenient shorthand that allowed scientists to refer unambiguously to a complex series of climatic, ecological, and evolutionary changes spanning roughly 2 million years. The scientific classification of the Carnian Pluvial Event involves both temporal and functional aspects. Temporally, it is situated in the Carnian stage, meaning that it occupies a particular interval in the formal geological timescale. The International Commission on Stratigraphy, the organization responsible for maintaining and updating the official global timescale, defines the Carnian as beginning approximately 233 million years ago and ending around 223 million years ago. Within this roughly 10 million year span, the pluvial event is thought to have lasted about 2 million years, a relatively brief but geologically significant interval. Its recognition as a discrete episode allows geologists to anchor environmental and evolutionary studies within a specific time frame, facilitating comparisons across regions and disciplines. Functionally, the classification of the Carnian Pluvial Event also reflects its role as a driver of change. It is not merely a description of weather conditions, but a recognition that this climatic shift had profound consequences for the Earth system. Increased rainfall would have altered river systems, lake formation, soil development, and sediment transport, creating new habitats for plants and animals. At the same time, higher humidity and associated flooding could have stressed species adapted to dry environments, triggering extinctions in some groups. The combination of opportunity and stress during this period likely helped shape the subsequent evolution of terrestrial and marine life, setting the stage for the ecosystems that would dominate the later Triassic and Jurassic periods. In this sense, the Carnian Pluvial Event is classified not only as a climatic episode, but also as an important evolutionary and ecological event, bridging multiple fields of study. Understanding the origin of the name also provides insight into the history of geological research. The process by which geologists first studied the Carnic Alps, identified the distinct Carnian rock layers, and then correlated them with layers elsewhere in Europe and beyond, demonstrates the painstaking nature of stratigraphic work. It involved careful field observations, detailed mapping, fossil identification, and the analysis of rock chemistry and structure. Over time, as more data accumulated, patterns emerged, showing that the wet interval recorded in the rocks of the Carnic Alps had parallels in other parts of the world. This international perspective helped cement the idea that the pluvial event was global in scale and significant in its effects. Moreover, the naming process illustrates the interplay between local and global science. Many geological terms begin as local labels, tied to specific outcrops, towns, or regions. In this case, Carnian linked the interval to a particular part of the Alps, grounding the concept in a place where evidence could be directly observed. The addition of pluvial event elevated the label from a local convenience to a descriptor of a major phenomenon with far-reaching implications. By combining a geographic identifier with a functional description, the term communicates both where the evidence was first found and what the defining feature of the interval was, creating a clear and informative name that has endured in scientific discourse. The classification of the Carnian Pluvial Event also has implications for modern scientific research. Knowing the timing and characteristics of this interval allows researchers to examine the causes of climatic change in deep time, compare them with contemporary climate processes, and explore how ecosystems respond to shifts in rainfall and temperature. It also provides a framework for studying the interplay between volcanic activity, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, ocean chemistry, and biological evolution. In essence, the name is a gateway to understanding a complex network of interactions that shaped the Earth nearly 230 million years ago. In addition to its scientific importance, the term has also shaped the way geologists communicate with the public and with each other. It is easier to discuss patterns of rainfall, extinction, and evolution when a clear, recognized term is available. Scientists can reference the Carnian Pluvial Event in lectures, articles, and educational materials, allowing students, researchers, and the interested public to grasp the concept without needing to wade through detailed stratigraphic descriptions every time. The adoption of a clear, descriptive name thus enhances the accessibility and clarity of scientific knowledge. It is also worth noting that the recognition of the Carnian Pluvial Event reflects the broader evolution of paleoclimatology as a field. Earlier generations of geologists often focused primarily on describing rocks and fossils, with less attention to the climate signals they contained. Over time, however, it became clear that rocks, fossils, and geochemical signatures could reveal detailed stories about ancient climates, rainfall patterns, and environmental stress. The naming of the Carnian Pluvial Event is a milestone in this evolution, representing a point at which scientists explicitly identified a climatic episode, traced its global effects, and linked it to biological and ecological consequences. While the general outline of the Carnian Pluvial Event is widely accepted, scientists are still investigating its precise causes, duration, and impacts. Some researchers emphasize the role of volcanic eruptions in triggering the climatic changes, while others focus on shifts in ocean circulation or atmospheric composition. New discoveries of fossils, sediments, and isotopic data continue to refine our understanding of the event, showing that even a term with a long history can be a living part of scientific inquiry. The combination of historical context, careful observation, and modern analysis illustrates how naming and classifying an event in Earth's deep past is both a scientific achievement and a foundation for future exploration. 4S. The Carnian Pluvial Event began around 235 million years ago, during a period of the late Triassic known as the Carnian stage. This was a time when the Earth's climate, which had been largely dry and hot, began to shift dramatically. For roughly 2 million years, rainfall increased across many regions of the planet, transforming arid landscapes into wetlands, swelling rivers, and filling lakes. This prolonged period of wet conditions created new habitats for plants and animals, while simultaneously challenging those species adapted to dry environments. Evidence from sedimentary rocks shows that this increase in rainfall was not a simple, uniform phenomenon. Layers of mud, silt, and sandstone indicate periods of intense water flow, flooding, and changes in river paths. Fossilized plants reveal that forests expanded into areas that had been dominated by drought-tolerant vegetation, while new types of ferns, horsetails, and conifers began to flourish. Marine fossils, such as ammonites, demonstrate that ocean environments were also affected, with species diversifying and spreading in response to changes in nutrient levels and water chemistry. On land, reptiles, early dinosaurs, and other vertebrates adapted to wetter conditions, some thriving while others declined or disappeared. The beginning of this event can be traced through careful geological analysis. Scientists have studied rock formations on multiple continents, including Europe, North America, South America, and Asia, finding consistent signs of increased rainfall and climatic change. Radiometric dating, which measures the decay of radioactive elements in rocks, combined with magnetostratigraphy and the study of fossils, allows researchers to pinpoint the start of the pluvial phase with remarkable precision. All these methods together indicate that the event began approximately 235 million years ago and continued for about 2 million years. This duration is long enough to influence evolutionary trends, shape ecosystems, and leave a lasting mark on the Earth's geological and biological record. During these 2 million years, the rainfall did not remain constant. Evidence suggests that wet and dry intervals alternated, creating cycles of flooding and temporary droughts. These fluctuations had a profound impact on the development of soils, river systems, and vegetation. Areas that had previously been deserts could briefly transform into marshes or lakes, allowing new plant species to take root and providing food and shelter for animals. The alternating wet and dry conditions acted as a selective pressure, favoring species that could adapt to sudden environmental changes and challenging those less capable of surviving. Volcanic activity appears to have contributed significantly to the onset and persistence of the Carnian Pluvial Event. Large-scale eruptions released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, warming the planet and altering global weather patterns. This created the conditions for more intense rainfall, leading to widespread flooding and changes in both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. Geological deposits from this time, known as flood basalts, support this connection, showing that the eruption events align closely with the beginning of the pluvial phase. The combination of volcanic activity and changing rainfall patterns demonstrates that the event was a global phenomenon, not limited to a single region. The 2 million-year duration of the Carnian Pluvial Event is significant not only in terms of climate, but also in terms of evolution. During this time, entire groups of organisms experienced the consequences of environmental stress. Some plant species went extinct while others spread into new areas. New reptile species, early dinosaurs, and other vertebrates emerged, filling ecological niches left open by extinct species. Marine life also responded to these changes, with ammonites and other ocean creatures diversifying in the changing conditions. By the end of the event, around 233 million years ago, the climate gradually returned to drier conditions, but the ecological and evolutionary impacts remained evident in the fossil record. Understanding the timeline and duration of the Carnian Pluvial Event provides insight into the relationship between climate and life on Earth. 2 million years of fluctuating rainfall allowed ecosystems to reorganize, species to evolve, and new environmental patterns to emerge. The event highlights the way life responds to long-term climate changes, showing both the resilience and vulnerability of different organisms. It also emphasizes the importance of precise geological dating in reconstructing Earth's history, as researchers combine multiple lines of evidence to create a detailed timeline that stretches across continents and oceans. Sedimentary evidence, fossil data, and geochemical markers all converge to paint a picture of the Carnian Pluvial Event as a time of both destruction and opportunity. Floods reshaped landscapes, wetlands formed where deserts had once dominated, and rivers carved new channels across Pangaea. These environmental transformations occurred over a span of roughly 2 million years, long enough for significant evolutionary changes to take place. Life adapted, moved into new habitats, or faced extinction, leaving a record that scientists can study millions of years later to understand how climate influences evolution on a global scale. By tracking the start around 235 million years ago and the approximate duration of 2 million years, scientists can see not just a period of rainfall, but an epoch that altered the trajectory of life on Earth. The event shows that long-term environmental change can drive both extinction and diversification, shaping the ecosystems of the future. Its timeline demonstrates the deep connections between geology, climate, and biology, providing a window into the forces that have shaped our planet over immense spans of time. The Carnian Pluvial Event also illustrates the complexity of Earth's systems. Rainfall alone cannot account for the full impact. Volcanic eruptions, shifts in atmospheric chemistry, changes in ocean circulation, and evolving ecosystems all interacted to produce the conditions that lasted for 2 million years. By studying the timeline, scientists can better understand how these factors combined to create a global climatic event, offering lessons for interpreting other episodes of environmental change in Earth's deep past. The 2 million-year span of the Carnian Pluvial Event serves as a benchmark for understanding long-term climate change. The timeline, stretching from approximately 235 million to 233 million years ago, allows scientists to measure the rate of environmental change, track the spread of life forms, and connect geological events across the globe. It is a powerful example of how Earth's history is written in rocks, fossils, and chemical signatures, a record that can reveal the rhythm and duration of events that shape the planet over vast stretches of time. By the end of the Carnian Pluvial Event, life on Earth had been transformed. The 2 million years of increased rainfall had created opportunities for new species to emerge, for landscapes to be reshaped, and for ecosystems to reorganize. Even as the climate returned to drier conditions, the legacy of this extended period of wetness persisted in the composition of forests, the distribution of rivers and lakes, and the evolutionary history of animals both on land and in the seas. The timeline captures not only the beginning and end of this remarkable event, but also the enduring effects that lasted long after the rain ceased. 4S. The Wrangellia Eruptions were among the most vast and powerful volcanic events in Earth's long history. These eruptions produced enormous floods of lava that spread across huge areas of the planet, changed the atmosphere, and influenced the climate and life on Earth itself. Scientists have spent decades uncovering their story by studying ancient rocks and fossils exposed in places such as Alaska, the Yukon, and Vancouver Island. From the clues preserved in these rocks, researchers have learned not only about the volcanic eruptions themselves, but also about how they helped transform the environment and shape the course of life during a crucial period of Earth's past. The Wrangellia Eruptions took place during a part of Earth's history known as the Triassic period. This was a time long before humans existed, many tens of millions of years before the age of dinosaurs reached its peak. During the late Triassic, about 230 million years ago, conditions on Earth were changing. The world looked very different from what it does now. The continents that we know today had not yet reached their present positions. Instead, much of the land on Earth was joined together into a gigantic supercontinent called Pangaea. Surrounding this supercontinent was one vast ocean, often called Panthalassa. The climate and ecosystems were in flux, and life on land and in the sea was evolving in remarkable directions. The planet was dynamic, moving, shaking, and reshaping itself in ways that would set the stage for the next great chapters in its history. In the midst of this dynamic world, deep volcanic activity began to build under what was then oceanic crust, far from the landmass that would become Western North America. This volcanic region came to be known as the Wrangellia terrane. A terrane is a distinct piece of Earth's crust that has a history different from the areas around it. Wrangellia originally formed in an oceanic setting, accumulating layer upon layer of basaltic lava on the seafloor. Over millions of years, these layers became incredibly thick, sometimes several kilometers deep, and spread over huge distances. Eventually, this block of crust traveled through tectonic motions and collided with the growing edge of the North American continent. When it became attached, it carried its vast volcanic record with it. The lava flows produced during the Wrangellia eruptions were massive. They formed broad sheets of basaltic rock, and geologists estimate that they could cover hundreds of thousands or possibly millions of square kilometers. In many regions, the volcanic rocks that originated from these eruptions are thick and widespread enough to be seen across entire mountain ranges. At certain locations, ancient lava flows more than 5,000 meters thick are preserved in the rock record. These flows tell a story of extended volcanic activity that lasted for millions of years, producing a remarkable volume of lava that reshaped the ocean floor and eventually the continents themselves. Unlike volcanic eruptions that occur as isolated events, the Wrangellia eruptions were part of what scientists call a large igneous province. A large igneous province, or LIP, is a region where the Earth releases an extraordinary amount of molten rock over a relatively brief period of geological time. The eruptions that create lips are not like the volcanic explosions people may see today. They are far more extensive and long-lasting. The lava often pours from fissures, long cracks in the crust, and flows outward, blanketing wide areas with molten rock. In the case of Wrangellia, the lava built up layer upon layer, producing thick sheets of basalt that eventually solidified into the rocks we can study today. The eruption of such vast quantities of lava was not the only remarkable aspect of Wrangellia. As the molten rock reached the surface, it released enormous quantities of volcanic gases, including carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, water vapor, and other substances. Some of these gases, such as carbon dioxide and water vapor, are known as greenhouse gases because they trap heat in the atmosphere and tend to warm the planet. Others, like sulfur dioxide, can form tiny particles that reflect sunlight and can temporarily cool surface temperatures. But even sulfur dioxide, when combined with water in the atmosphere, can produce acid rain that affects soils, vegetation, and the chemistry of rivers and oceans. When the Wrangellia eruptions began releasing these gases into the ancient atmosphere, the effects were not confined to the local region. They spread around the globe. The climate began to change. Evidence from sedimentary rocks around the world shows that rainfall patterns shifted, and the climate became more humid in many regions. Areas that were once dry deserts developed lakes and swampy landscapes. Layers of sediment deposited during this time indicate that widespread erosion occurred as water flowed across the land more intensely than before. In the oceans, changes in temperature and chemistry impacted marine life. Scientists refer to this chapter of Earth's climate history as a period of environmental upheaval. The warming induced by increased greenhouse gases, combined with changes in rainfall and ocean circulation, created conditions that were very different from those that preceded the eruptions. Some researchers call this interval the Carnian Pluvial episode. During this time, the planet became wetter and warmer, triggering a cascade of changes in ecosystems on land and in the sea. Plants adapted to more humid climates began to flourish. Animals that had been limited to certain types of environments began to spread into new areas, and many species that could not adjust faced extinction. The fossil record from this time shows evidence of both loss and innovation. In some regions, species disappear from the rock record. In others, new forms of life appear or become more diverse. For example, the early Mesozoic era, which includes the Triassic period, witnessed the rise of early dinosaurs and other reptilian groups that would later dominate the land for tens of millions of years. Some scientists believe that the environmental changes linked to the Wrangellia eruptions helped open new ecological niches that these pioneering creatures could exploit. The result was not only a reshaping of landscapes and climates, but also a reshaping of life itself. To reconstruct this ancient story, scientists use a variety of tools and methods. One of the most important is radiometric dating, a technique that measures the decay of radioactive elements in rocks to determine their ages. By applying this method to volcanic rocks from Wrangellia, researchers can estimate when the lava flows occurred, providing a timeline for the eruptions. Chemical analyses of rock samples reveal the composition of the lava and the gases released during volcanism. Fossils preserved in sedimentary layers above, below, and between the volcanic rocks provide clues about how life on Earth was changing at the same time. Another powerful line of evidence comes from the study of isotopes, variants of elements that can shift in abundance when environmental conditions change. For instance, changes in carbon isotopes preserved in ancient marine sediments can reflect shifts in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. When large amounts of volcanic carbon dioxide are released, the balance of carbon isotopes can change in a way that leaves a detectable imprint in rock layers. Mercury, another element often released in volcanic eruptions, can also be concentrated in ancient sediments, serving as a fingerprint of intense volcanic activity. One of the remarkable things about the Wrangellia eruptions is that they did not occur all at once. Instead, the volcanic activity built up in pulses over millions of years. In each pulse, molten rock rose from deep within the Earth's mantle, spread across the sea floor, and released gases into the air. Between pulses, quieter periods allowed rivers, lakes, and soils to develop, leaving sedimentary deposits that recorded the changing environmental conditions between eruptions. These alternating layers of volcanic rock and sediment provide a richly detailed archive of the interactions between Earth's interior processes and surface environments. As the lava flows accumulated, they formed what is known as an oceanic plateau, a region of thickened crust on the seafloor. These plateaus are unique features in Earth's geology. They are not built by single explosive volcanic events, but by long-lasting outpourings of lava over wide areas. In the case of Wrangellia, the plateau eventually became part of the continental margin as tectonic plates shifted and collided. This process transported the volcanic rocks from their original location in the ocean to become part of the edge of North America. Today, geologists can study these rocks where they are exposed in mountain ranges, river valleys, and coastal cliffs, offering direct evidence of ancient volcanic processes that occurred hundreds of millions of years ago. Deep processes, originating hundreds of kilometers beneath the crust, can have far-reaching consequences. When vast amounts of greenhouse gases are released, they alter the balance of heat in the atmosphere, which in turn can change weather patterns, sea levels, and ecosystems. Although there have been other large volcanic events in Earth's history, the Wrangellia eruptions stand out for both their magnitude and their timing. They occurred during a time of major ecological transition, when the foundations were being laid for the future dominance of new groups of animals and plants. Climates shifted from more arid conditions to wetter and warmer patterns. New habitats emerged. Old ones vanished. The world changed, not overnight, but over hundreds of thousands and millions of years, shaped by volcanic fire, shifting oceans, and living organisms pushing to adapt and survive. Understanding the Wrangellia eruptions also helps scientists think about the ways in which Earth responds to large changes in atmospheric composition. Today, human activities are increasing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a rapid rate. While the source and timescale are different from ancient volcanic events, the principle remains the same. When greenhouse gases increase, they can warm the planet and drive changes in climate and ecosystems. By studying ancient episodes like Wrangellia, researchers gain insights into how Earth systems respond to changes in greenhouse gas levels, how long those changes may last, and how life can adapt or struggle in response. The rocks formed by the Wrangellia eruptions stand as silent witnesses to these ancient forces. By studying them, scientists piece together the timing, scale, and consequences of volcanic events that once blanketed vast regions under molten rock. The fossils found near those volcanic layers tell the parallel story of life pressing forward through changing climates, finding new opportunities, but also facing new challenges. Greenhouse gases have become one of the most critical factors affecting the climate of our planet. These gases, including carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and water vapor, act like a blanket around the Earth. They allow sunlight to enter, warming the surface, but trap some of the heat that would otherwise escape into space. This natural process, known as the greenhouse effect, is essential for life, because without it, the Earth's surface would be far too cold to sustain most living organisms. The problem arises when the concentration of these gases increases beyond natural levels, intensifying the warming effect and leading to changes in the climate that can have dramatic consequences for ecosystems, weather patterns, and human societies. Carbon dioxide is the most prominent greenhouse gas produced by human activities. Its levels have risen dramatically over the last 2 centuries. Measurements show that for hundreds of thousands of years before the modern age, atmospheric carbon dioxide remained below 300 parts per million. Yet today, carbon dioxide exceeds 420 parts per million, a level that is unprecedented in at least 3 million years. The primary source of this increase is the burning of fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas. When these fuels are burned to produce energy for transportation, industry, and electricity, carbon stored for millions of years underground is released into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide. Deforestation also contributes because trees absorb carbon dioxide, and cutting them down removes this natural storage mechanism while often releasing additional carbon through burning or decay. The rise of greenhouse gases is directly linked to the increase in global temperatures. Average global surface temperature has already risen by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius since the late 19th century, which is significant when considering the stability of Earth's climate over the previous thousands of years. This warming is not evenly distributed, however. The Arctic has warmed more rapidly than the tropics, leading to dramatic melting of glaciers, ice sheets, and permafrost. The consequences of this warming include rising sea levels, changes in ocean circulation, and the increasing frequency of extreme weather events such as heat waves, hurricanes, and intense rainfall. Methane is another important greenhouse gas, although less abundant than carbon dioxide. It is about 25 times more effective than carbon dioxide at trapping heat over a 100-year period. Methane comes from both natural and human sources. Wetlands are a major natural source, as they release methane during the decay of organic matter in waterlogged soils. Human activities, however, have dramatically increased methane emissions. Livestock, especially cows, produce large amounts of methane through digestion, and the gas is also released from landfills, rice paddies, and the extraction and transport of fossil fuels. Even though methane does not remain in the atmosphere as long as carbon dioxide, about 10 years compared to carbon dioxide's centuries, it significantly contributes to warming because of its high heat-trapping potential. Nitrous oxide is another greenhouse gas that plays a smaller but still significant role in climate change. It is produced mainly by agricultural activities, especially through the use of nitrogen-based fertilizers. Nitrous oxide is roughly 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide in trapping heat over a century-long period. It also persists in the atmosphere for more than 100 years. In addition to its warming potential, nitrous oxide contributes to the depletion of the ozone layer, which protects life from harmful ultraviolet radiation. Industrial activities and biomass burning also contribute to nitrous oxide emissions, creating a combined effect that accelerates both climate warming and ozone loss. The increase in these greenhouse gases has consequences that are visible across the planet. Global temperature rise affects the hydrological cycle, altering precipitation patterns and making droughts more severe in some regions while intensifying rainfall in others. This creates challenges for agriculture, water supply, and human health. Rising temperatures also affect ecosystems, forcing plants and animals to adapt, migrate, or face extinction. Coral reefs, for instance, are particularly sensitive to warming oceans. Even a rise of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius in ocean temperature can cause widespread coral bleaching, where corals expel the algae that provide them with food and color. If the warming continues, many reef ecosystems may collapse entirely, threatening the biodiversity that depends on them. Ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica provide another clear signal of climate warming caused by greenhouse gases. As temperatures rise, ice sheets lose mass through melting and calving, releasing fresh water into the oceans. This contributes to sea level rise, which has already accelerated over the last several decades. Since 1990, global sea levels have risen by more than 8 centimeters, and projections suggest they could rise by up to 1 meter or more by the end of this century if greenhouse gas emissions continue at current rates. Rising sea levels threaten coastal cities, low-lying islands, and deltas that are home to millions of people. Saltwater intrusion can contaminate freshwater supplies, and flooding can damage infrastructure, homes, and agricultural land, creating both environmental and social crises. Ocean temperatures are also rising as a result of greenhouse gas accumulation. Oceans absorb more than 90% of the excess heat trapped by greenhouse gases. This leads to thermal expansion, where water expands as it warms, further raising sea levels. Warmer oceans also affect marine life. Fish populations may shift toward cooler regions, disrupting fisheries and threatening communities that depend on fishing for food and livelihood. Ocean warming contributes to more intense storms as well, because warmer water provides more energy for tropical cyclones, hurricanes, and typhoons. These storms are becoming more powerful and destructive, reflecting the connection between greenhouse gas-driven warming and extreme weather. Another critical impact of greenhouse gases is the feedback mechanisms they trigger, which can accelerate warming. For example, as ice and snow melt, They expose darker land or water surfaces that absorb more sunlight instead of reflecting it. This leads to further warming, more melting, and a self-reinforcing cycle. Similarly, thawing permafrost releases methane and carbon dioxide that have been trapped for thousands of years. These additional greenhouse gases then enhance warming, creating another feedback loop. Scientists are particularly concerned about these feedbacks because they can lead to rapid and potentially irreversible changes in climate, even if human emissions are reduced later. The scientific evidence linking greenhouse gas emissions to climate warming is overwhelming. Temperature records from weather stations, satellites, and ocean buoys all show a consistent trend of rising temperatures over the last century. Ice core data provides a long-term perspective, showing that current carbon dioxide levels are unprecedented in hundreds of thousands of years. Climate models, which use mathematical representations of the Earth's climate system, consistently demonstrate that the observed warming cannot be explained by natural factors alone, such as changes in solar radiation or volcanic activity. Human activities, particularly the burning of fossil fuels and land use changes, are the dominant cause. Addressing greenhouse gas emissions is essential to slowing and eventually reversing climate warming. The most effective strategies involve reducing the use of fossil fuels, transitioning to renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydropower, and protecting and restoring forests, which act as natural carbon sinks. Improvements in energy efficiency, changes in agricultural practices, and innovations in carbon capture and storage can also help limit emissions. International agreements, such as the Paris Agreement of 2015, aim to coordinate global efforts to limit temperature rise to well below 2 degrees Celsius, with an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Achieving these goals requires cooperation across nations, industries, and communities. Individual actions also contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Choices in transportation, diet, energy use, and consumption patterns all play a role. For example, using public transportation, reducing meat consumption, and conserving electricity can collectively lower carbon footprints. Raising awareness about the causes and consequences of climate warming helps build public support for policies that reduce emissions and protect the environment. Education and advocacy empower communities to take meaningful steps towards sustainability, emphasizing that the challenge of greenhouse gas-induced warming is not only global but also personal. Monitoring and research remain critical in understanding and responding to greenhouse gas-driven climate change. Advances in technology allow scientists to track emissions, study atmospheric composition, and project future climate scenarios with increasing accuracy. Satellites provide detailed data on greenhouse gas concentrations, land use, and ocean temperatures, while climate models simulate complex interactions between the atmosphere, oceans, ice, and biosphere. These tools help policymakers make informed decisions about adaptation and mitigation strategies. Long-term research also provides insights into potential tipping points, where small changes could lead to rapid and irreversible shifts in climate, emphasizing the urgency of immediate action. The consequences of continued greenhouse gas accumulation are profound. Rising temperatures threaten food security, water availability, human health, and biodiversity. Extreme weather events, sea level rise, and ecosystem disruptions have economic, social, and political implications. Vulnerable populations, especially in developing countries and coastal regions, face the greatest risks. The window for preventing the worst impacts is narrowing, making immediate and sustained action critical. Without significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, future generations may inherit a planet vastly different from the one we know today, with hotter temperatures, more extreme weather, and diminished natural resources. The period known as the Carnian Pluvial Event, which took place during the late Triassic period, represents one of the most dramatic shifts in Earth's climate over deep time, and it is defined by the sudden onset of extreme rainfall after a long interval of relatively dry conditions. This transition was not merely a minor fluctuation in the weather, it was a profound and dramatic transformation that affected every corner of the planet, reshaping landscapes, altering ecosystems, and influencing the course of evolution in ways that scientists are still uncovering today. To fully appreciate this transformation, we must first imagine the state of the world before the rains began, a world dominated by arid lands, parched soils, and vegetation that had adapted to enduring prolonged periods of dryness. The continents were arranged differently than they are now, with the vast supercontinent of Pangaea stretching from pole to pole, creating enormous interior regions far from the moderating influence of oceans. These interior lands were subject to extreme seasonal variations, and during the dry periods, temperatures could soar and water sources could dwindle to nearly nothing. Life in this dry world had adapted to these harsh conditions, with plants and animals evolving strategies to survive long stretches without substantial rainfall. Forests were limited in size, and vast stretches of open semi-arid terrain were common. Rivers and lakes existed, but their flow was often intermittent, shrinking during dry seasons and expanding only when rare storms swept across the land. Then, relatively abruptly in geological terms, the climate shifted. Evidence from sediments, isotopic studies, and fossil records indicates that the Carnian Pluvial Event brought a prolonged and intense phase of rainfall, dramatically transforming the landscapes. Areas that had once been arid deserts or dry savannas became lush and swampy. Rivers that had been mere trickles or seasonal streams grew into permanent waterways, carving valleys and depositing thick layers of sediment across the lowlands. Lakes expanded, and in some regions shallow seas transgressed, inundating the land with water. This transition was not uniform. It occurred at different rates in different parts of the world, depending on latitude, altitude, and proximity to the ocean, but the overall effect was unmistakable: a global shift toward wetter and more humid conditions. The rainfall was not just more frequent, it was often extreme, with storms of unprecedented intensity pouring immense volumes of water onto the land, eroding soils, reshaping river channels, and depositing vast layers of sediment that scientists now study to reconstruct this ancient deluge. One of the remarkable aspects of this transition is how rapid it appears to have been. Geological evidence suggests that within a span of just tens of thousands of years, a blink of an eye in Earth's history, the climate system flipped from dry to intensely wet conditions. Isotopic analyses of carbon, oxygen, and other elements in sedimentary rocks reveal significant perturbations in the global carbon cycle, indicating changes in atmospheric composition that may have triggered or amplified this rainfall. Carbon dioxide concentrations rose, likely due to massive volcanic activity, which in turn increased global temperatures. Warmer air holds more moisture, and this could have driven the extraordinary precipitation levels. The combination of increased heat and higher moisture content in the atmosphere created conditions for persistent and heavy rainfall, flooding landscapes that had long been parched. This shift from dryness to wetness had profound consequences for life on Earth. Ecosystems that had evolved under dry conditions suddenly faced a very different reality. Plant communities were among the first to respond. Many of the hardy, drought-tolerant species that had dominated the landscapes struggled to cope with the new, saturated soils and constant availability of water. At the same time, opportunistic plants that thrived in moist environments quickly spread, filling ecological niches left vacant by the decline of arid-adapted species. Ferns, horsetails, and early gymnosperms, which preferred wetter conditions, flourished, and in some regions, dense forests replaced what had previously been open, dry landscapes. The change in vegetation was not merely a local phenomenon, but a global pattern, as fossil evidence from distant continents reveals similar shifts in plant assemblages during this period. The rainfall also had dramatic effects on animal life. Terrestrial animals, from small invertebrates to large archosaurs, were forced to adapt to wetter habitats. For some, the new conditions offered opportunities. Amphibians, for example, which rely on water bodies for reproduction, expanded their range, taking advantage of the newly abundant ponds, rivers, and swamps. Aquatic and semi-aquatic creatures thrived, and in some regions entirely new ecosystems emerged, dominated by species that had previously been restricted to specific niches. For others, however, the sudden environmental change posed severe challenges. Animals adapted to arid conditions faced habitat loss, and competition for resources intensified as new species colonized areas that had once been relatively stable. The combined stress of changing habitats, competition, and altered food webs led to extinctions in some groups, while others diversified rapidly, taking advantage of the newly available ecological opportunities. Sedimentary records from this period provide compelling evidence of the intensity and persistence of the rainfall. Thick sequences of mudstone, shale, and clay-rich deposits indicate prolonged periods of waterlogging and frequent flooding. These sediments often contain fossils of plants and animals that were buried quickly, suggesting sudden inundations or repeated episodes of heavy rain. In some locations, the sediments reveal patterns of cyclical flooding, where alternating layers indicate periods of higher and lower water levels, reflecting the complex interplay of rainfall, temperature, and sea level changes. The sheer volume of sediment deposited during this period also suggests that rivers were carrying far more material than in previous dry conditions, reshaping valleys and plains and leaving a lasting mark on the landscape. Volcanic activity may have played a crucial role in driving this shift from dry to wet conditions. Large igneous provinces, such as those associated with the Wrangellia eruptions in what is now Western North America, released vast quantities of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other gases into the atmosphere. These emissions contributed to global warming, disrupted weather patterns, and likely enhanced rainfall. The connection between volcanic activity and climate change is well established in modern Earth science, and the Carnian Pluvial Event provides a clear example of how massive eruptions can influence global climate. The volcanic gases may have caused both long-term warming and short-term cooling episodes, depending on the balance between greenhouse gases and aerosols, creating a dynamic climate system in which rainfall patterns could intensify rapidly. The hydrological changes brought about by the onset of extreme rainfall were equally transformative. Rivers not only expanded, but also changed in character, shifting from intermittent or braided streams to more stable, meandering systems. Floodplains developed, lakes grew larger, and wetlands became more extensive, creating habitats that could support diverse plant and animal communities. These wetland systems were particularly important for early vertebrates, as they provided breeding grounds, food resources, and shelter from predators. Over time, the accumulation of organic-rich sediments in these environments contributed to the formation of coal and other fossil fuel deposits, leaving a record of the Carnian rains that would persist for millions of years. The intensity of the rainfall also had direct impacts on soil formation and nutrient cycling. Previously, dry soils, often thin and nutrient-poor, were subjected to intense leaching as water percolated through them, washing away soluble minerals and redistributing nutrients across the landscape. This process created new fertile soils in some regions, supporting the expansion of forests and other plant communities. In other areas, however, heavy rains caused erosion and loss of topsoil, reshaping hillsides and altering drainage patterns. The combination of erosion, sediment deposition, and nutrient redistribution illustrates how a simple change in rainfall can have cascading effects on the environment, influencing both geological and biological processes. Climatic models and paleoclimate reconstructions suggest that the increase in rainfall was accompanied by higher temperatures and increased humidity worldwide. This combination of heat and moisture created a climate regime that was radically different from the arid conditions that had prevailed for millions of years. Tropical and subtropical regions likely experienced persistent wet seasons, with rainfall occurring not just during isolated storms, but as a continual feature of the climate. Monsoon-like systems may have developed in some areas, driven by temperature differences between land and sea, further amplifying rainfall and sustaining wet habitats over extended periods. Marine environments were also affected by this transition. Rivers carrying increased sediment and nutrients into the oceans influenced coastal and shallow marine ecosystems. Nutrient enrichment could have stimulated plankton blooms, altering food webs and promoting the diversification of marine species. Conversely, increased runoff may have contributed to anoxic events in some basins where oxygen levels dropped due to decomposition of organic matter, creating challenging conditions for marine life. These interactions between terrestrial and marine systems highlight the interconnectedness of Earth's climate, showing that a shift in rainfall on land can ripple outward to affect the oceans and the creatures that inhabit them. The fossil record provides striking evidence of the impact of this climatic shift on life. Plant fossils indicate a sudden change in species composition, with previously rare wet-adapted plants becoming dominant. Pollen and spore records show that ferns and other moisture-loving plants expanded rapidly, replacing drought-tolerant species. Animal fossils also reflect these changes, with amphibians, reptiles, and early dinosaurs appearing in greater numbers in newly wet environments, while some arid-adapted species decline or disappear. The combination of extinction, migration, and diversification illustrates the dramatic ecological consequences of transitioning from dry to wet conditions. One of the most significant effects of the Carnian Pluvial Event was its influence on evolution. By altering habitats and creating new ecological opportunities, the extreme rainfall set the stage for the rise of new species and the decline of others. Groups that could exploit wet environments flourished, while those specialized for arid conditions faced challenges. This period of rapid environmental change acted as a driver of evolutionary experimentation, favoring adaptability and resilience. Over the following millions of years, the legacy of these changes would be seen in the diversification of dinosaurs, the expansion of modern plant lineages, and the establishment of ecosystems that would shape the Mesozoic world. In addition to biological impacts, the onset of extreme rainfall reshaped the physical world in ways that would be preserved for tens of millions of years. River valleys deepened, floodplains expanded, and sedimentary basins filled with thick layers of mud and sand. These geological features, visible in the rock record today, provide a window into the intensity and duration of the Carnian rains. They allow scientists to reconstruct the scale of the floods, the frequency of storms, and the broader environmental conditions, offering a detailed picture of how a shift in rainfall can transform the Earth. It is important to recognize that the onset of extreme rainfall during the Carnian Pluvial Event was part of a complex interplay of factors, including volcanic activity, greenhouse gas fluctuations, changes in ocean circulation, and the arrangement of continents. These factors worked together to produce a climate system that was highly dynamic, capable of switching from prolonged dryness to intense wetness within relatively short periods. Understanding this interplay helps scientists appreciate how sensitive Earth's climate can be, how changes in one part of the system can cascade to affect the whole planet, and how these ancient events can inform our understanding of modern climate dynamics. The human imagination has been captivated by these ancient rains, and scientists continue to study them to uncover the full story. Each layer of sediment, each fossil, and each isotopic measurement adds detail to the picture of a world transformed by water. The Carnian Pluvial Event left an unmistakable mark on the rocks of the late Triassic period, around 233 million years ago. The evidence is recorded in the sediments, clay deposits, and chemical signatures preserved in layers across continents. These layers are like the Earth's own historical record, showing clearly how climates shifted from relatively dry conditions to a phase of intense and prolonged rainfall that lasted roughly 2 million years. Each rock layer contains unique details about rainfall intensity, water chemistry, temperature fluctuations, and ecological transformations, all of which help scientists reconstruct the events of that distant time with remarkable precision. Sediments are one of the clearest indicators of environmental change. They are composed of fragments of older rocks, minerals, and bits of biological material that have been transported by wind, water, or ice, and eventually settled to form solid layers. During the Carnian Pluvial Event, an unusually large volume of sediments accumulated in river valleys, lakes, and shallow seas. The thickness and composition of these sediments show a sudden increase in rainfall and erosion. Layers that were previously thin, indicating slow deposition under arid conditions, suddenly became thick and abundant, suggesting that storms, floods, and heavy runoff were washing massive quantities of soil and minerals into basins. Scientists studying sections in regions such as present-day Europe, North America, South America, and parts of Asia noticed a clear pattern. The sediments from the Carnian Pluvial Event are coarser in many areas, implying more violent water flow, while in other locations they contain finer particles, indicating lakes or lagoons that slowly accumulated mud and silt under persistent wet conditions. Clay deposits provide another vital clue. Clay is formed when minerals, especially feldspars and volcanic ash, break down through chemical weathering. During periods of heavy and prolonged rainfall, chemical weathering is accelerated because water dissolves minerals more effectively, breaking down rocks into clay minerals such as kaolinite, illite, and smectite. Layers of clay-rich sediments from the Carnian Pluvial Event are widespread and often interspersed with layers of sandstone or siltstone, marking repeated cycles of heavy rainfall followed by periods of calmer deposition. In some parts of what is now Italy, Austria, and Greenland, these clay layers reach several meters in thickness, and their mineral composition indicates that the rainfall was not only abundant, but persistent over thousands of years. The presence of certain clay minerals, like kaolinite, also hints at warm, humid conditions because these minerals form more readily in tropical or subtropical environments under constant water availability. Chemical signatures in rock layers offer perhaps the most precise evidence of environmental changes during the Carnian Pluvial Event. Among the most informative are the isotopic ratios of carbon, oxygen, and strontium found in carbonates, fossil shells, and organic matter. Carbon isotopes can indicate changes in the global carbon cycle, often linked to massive volcanic activity, which is believed to have occurred in the Wrangellia region of what is now Western North America. The release of enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and methane during volcanic eruptions would have warmed the atmosphere and intensified the hydrological cycle, producing heavier and more frequent rainfall. In rock layers corresponding to the Carnian Pluvial Event, carbon isotope ratios show a sharp shift, reflecting a sudden perturbation in carbon levels worldwide. This shift is consistently observed in marine carbonates and terrestrial sediments across multiple continents, indicating that the climate changes were global rather than local. Oxygen isotopes in fossil shells provide additional insights into temperature and precipitation patterns. During the Carnian Pluvial Event, oxygen isotope ratios in marine organisms suggest that seawater temperatures fluctuated, warming in conjunction with heavy rainfall on land. These temperature changes influenced ocean circulation, rainfall distribution, and river flow, which in turn affected sediment deposition. For instance, fossilized shells from shallow marine environments show growth patterns and isotopic compositions consistent with seasonal flooding and increased freshwater input, reflecting the intensity of the pluvial period. Trace elements and rare earth elements also record environmental stress. Elements like uranium, molybdenum, and vanadium accumulate differently depending on oxygen availability and water chemistry. During the Carnian Pluvial Event, many layers contain elevated concentrations of these elements, suggesting periods of low oxygen in lakes and shallow seas. This could be a result of increased nutrient runoff from land due to heavy rainfall, which promoted algal blooms and subsequent oxygen depletion in water bodies. Such chemical evidence is critical for reconstructing not only the climate, but also the ecological consequences of the pluvial event, including the temporary collapse of some ecosystems and the rise of others better adapted to wet conditions. Fossil evidence embedded within these layers complements the sedimentary and chemical data. Plant fossils, particularly leaves and pollen, indicate a shift from drought-tolerant species to those favoring wetter, more humid environments. Ferns, horsetails, and certain types of conifers became more common, reflecting the dramatic change in precipitation and moisture availability. In riverine and lacustrine sediments, fish and amphibian fossils appear in greater abundance than in earlier dry layers, consistent with the expansion of lakes, rivers, and wetlands. Even insects and small terrestrial animals show changes, with some species appearing or disappearing in accordance with the wetter climate recorded in the rocks. The tight correlation between fossil evidence, sediment composition, and chemical signatures strengthens the interpretation of these layers as a direct record of the Carnian Pluvial Event. The geographical distribution of these layers also provides insight into the global nature of the event. Rocks of the same age showing similar clay deposits, sediment types, and isotopic signatures have been found across Europe, South America, North America, and parts of Asia. This widespread presence indicates that the rainfall increase was not a regional anomaly, but a global phenomenon affecting many land masses simultaneously. Moreover, the thickness and composition of these layers vary according to local geography, providing a detailed map of how different regions responded to the same climatic event. Lowland basins often contain thicker, finer-grained sediments, suggesting prolonged flooding and slow water deposition, while upland areas record coarser debris from intense storms and flash floods. Sedimentary structures within these layers also reveal patterns of rainfall, intensity, and water flow. Features such as cross-bedding, ripple marks, mud cracks, and graded bedding tell scientists about water velocity, sediment load, and seasonal variations. For example, the presence of mud cracks in some clay layers indicates temporary drying periods between heavy rains, while cross-bedded sandstones point to strong, directional water flows during storms. Together, these structures paint a picture of a dynamic environment where water levels, river currents, and lake depths were constantly changing in response to prolonged and variable rainfall. In addition to sediments and chemical markers, volcanic ash layers interbedded with pluvial sediments provide a timeline for the event. The Wrangellia Large Igneous Province, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, erupted around the same time as the Carnian Pluvial Event. Layers of ash preserved in rocks across multiple continents can be precisely dated using radiometric techniques, linking them to the timing of climate shifts. These ash layers serve as chronological markers, allowing scientists to correlate sediments from different locations and confirm that the increase in rainfall coincided with volcanic activity. This connection between volcanism, greenhouse gas release, and extreme rainfall is a central piece of the puzzle, showing how internal Earth processes influenced surface climate and ecosystems. Paleosols, or ancient soil horizons, provide another form of evidence. During the Carnian Pluvial Event, soil layers developed under wetter conditions contain abundant clay minerals, nodules of iron oxides, and signs of leaching, all of which indicate high rainfall and warm temperatures. In contrast, soils from the periods before and after the pluvial event are thinner, more compact, and less chemically altered, reflecting drier conditions. By studying these paleosols in conjunction with surrounding sediments, scientists can reconstruct the timing, intensity, and duration of the rainfall increase with surprising detail. Even the microscopic world preserved in rock layers contributes to understanding the event. Fossilized spores, pollen grains, and microbial mats record shifts in vegetation and microbial activity in response to wetter conditions. In some locations, microscopic analysis of clay and silt reveals seasonal cycles of sedimentation, suggesting that rainfall fluctuated over months and years, creating patterns that persisted over millennia. These microscopic clues, combined with macroscopic sedimentary and chemical evidence, provide a comprehensive picture of how the Carnian Pluvial Event transformed the planet. The study of these rock layers also reveals the broader consequences of the Carnian Pluvial Event. Heavy rainfall and increased river flow led to soil erosion and changes in landscape morphology, creating new habitats for plants and animals while destroying others. Lakes and wetlands expanded, providing environments for freshwater organisms to thrive, while some previously dominant species declined. The chemical changes in soils and water, driven by intense weathering and nutrient runoff, altered the availability of resources, influencing evolutionary pressures. The timing of these changes, recorded in sediments and chemical markers, corresponds closely with the diversification of dinosaurs and other terrestrial animals, suggesting that the pluvial event played a key role in shaping the trajectory of life on land. The collapse of coral reefs represents one of the most dramatic changes in the story of life on Earth, a shift that reshaped entire ocean ecosystems and left a profound mark in the rock record. Coral reefs, those vibrant, colorful underwater structures that teem with life, were once far more widespread and dominant in the seas than they are today. They formed vast, intricate frameworks built by tiny animals called corals, which belong to the same group as jellyfish. These corals, tiny but powerful engineers, secrete calcium carbonate, creating rigid skeletons that accumulate over thousands, even millions of years. The reefs they built were not just pretty underwater formations, they were bustling cities, providing shelter, food, and breeding grounds for an astonishing diversity of marine life. Fish, mollusks, sponges, and countless other organisms depended on these reefs for survival. Yet, despite their resilience, coral reefs are not invincible. There are times in Earth's history when they have experienced sudden and near-total collapse, disappearing from vast stretches of the oceans. The reasons for these collapses are complex, intertwined, and often dramatic, reflecting the dynamic and sometimes violent forces at work on our planet. A collapse does not happen overnight. It is usually the result of several pressures acting together over years, decades, or even centuries. Changes in temperature, chemistry, and the availability of nutrients in the oceans all play crucial roles, but sometimes massive events such as volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, or shifts in global climate can tip the balance, turning thriving reef ecosystems into ghostly remnants. One of the main drivers of coral reef collapse is a change in climate, particularly the warming or cooling of the oceans. Corals are highly sensitive to temperature, thriving only within a relatively narrow range. When ocean waters warm even slightly beyond this comfortable range, corals experience stress, often manifesting as bleaching. During bleaching, corals lose the tiny algae living within their tissues, algae that provide them with most of their energy through photosynthesis. Without these algae, corals weaken and become more susceptible to disease and death. While modern coral bleaching events are well documented, similar phenomena have occurred many times throughout Earth's deep history. Ancient warming periods, often triggered by volcanic eruptions or shifts in atmospheric carbon dioxide levels, created hostile conditions that reefs could not survive. Chemical changes in the oceans also play a pivotal role. The balance of salts and minerals in seawater is critical for corals to build their calcium carbonate skeletons. When this balance shifts, whether through ocean acidification caused by carbon dioxide dissolving into the sea, or through sudden influxes of nutrients from land, coral growth slows dramatically. In some cases, the very chemistry of the oceans changed so quickly that corals could no longer maintain their skeletons and entire reef structures began to crumble. Acidic waters dissolved calcium carbonate, eroding the very foundations of reef ecosystems. This chemical vulnerability is not just a modern problem. It has occurred repeatedly in the past, leaving traces in the rock record that show abrupt transitions from coral-rich layers to sediments dominated by other materials. Another major factor in reef collapse is the arrival of new competitors and predators. Coral reefs are crowded neighborhoods where space is at a premium. Organisms such as algae, sponges, and various types of sediment-producing microbes can rapidly colonize areas where corals are weakened or dying. When environmental stress strikes, these opportunistic organisms often take over, filling the void left by the corals. Algae, for example, can grow explosively in nutrient-rich waters, smothering remaining corals and preventing new ones from establishing themselves. In many ancient reef collapses, geologists can see layers of rock where coral fragments are interspersed with algae, sponges, or microbial mats, signaling that the reef was not simply gone but replaced by a different type of marine ecosystem. One of the most striking examples of coral reef collapse occurred during the end Triassic period, roughly 212 million years ago. During this time, coral reefs, which had been flourishing throughout the seas, suddenly vanished from much of the fossil record. Scientists believe that massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Western North America, part of a region called the Wrangellia province, released enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. These eruptions triggered rapid warming and significant changes in ocean chemistry. Evidence from sedimentary layers shows that reefs, once extensive and complex, broke down, and the spaces they occupied were soon filled with microbial mats and algae-dominated communities. The collapse of these reefs had cascading effects on marine life. Many species that relied on the reefs for habitat either went extinct or were forced to adapt to entirely new conditions. Similar patterns of reef collapse can be observed in other periods of Earth's history, such as during the Permian-Triassic extinction event about 253 million years ago. This event, the most severe mass extinction in Earth's history, wiped out nearly 90% of marine species, including almost all reef-building corals. In the aftermath, the seas were dominated by microbial reefs for millions of years, simple structures built not by corals, but by bacteria and algae. These microbial reefs were functional in their own way, providing some habitat complexity, but they were far less diverse and less productive than the coral reefs that preceded them. Geological layers from this time show a dramatic shift. Thick, complex limestone deposits give way to layers rich in microbial textures and debris, reflecting the collapse of established reef ecosystems and the rise of a simpler, more resilient, but less colorful and diverse community. The collapse of coral reefs is not only a story of disappearance, but also of transformation. When corals die off, other organisms move in, and entire ecosystems are reshaped. In some cases, the reef is replaced by thick layers of sediment that may eventually lithify into rock, preserving a snapshot of a world in turmoil. In other instances, reefs are taken over by different kinds of calcifying organisms, such as sponges or bryozoans, which can tolerate harsher conditions and form new but less elaborate reef structures. The fossil record captures these transitions in remarkable detail, allowing scientists to piece together the sequence of events and understand the interplay between climate, chemistry, and biology that drives such collapses. The replacement of coral reefs by other organisms also tells a story about resilience and adaptation. While corals may fail under extreme stress, the ocean does not remain lifeless. Microbes, algae, and hardier calcifying animals seize the opportunity to thrive, often altering the chemical and physical environment in ways that prevent corals from immediately returning. This shift can last for millions of years, as seen in the aftermath of the Permian-Triassic extinction, where microbial reefs dominated for an extended period before more complex coral systems re-emerged. Each collapse and subsequent replacement leaves a layered history in the rocks, a record of life's struggle to maintain its place in a changing world. Human eyes today are more accustomed to witnessing modern coral decline due to climate change, pollution, and ocean acidification. While the causes of ancient reef collapses were different in some respects, the fundamental lessons are strikingly similar. Coral reefs are incredibly productive and complex, but they are also fragile, sensitive to temperature changes, chemical shifts, and the arrival of new competitors. Their collapse marks profound transformations in ocean ecosystems, leading to long-lasting consequences for biodiversity, nutrient cycles, and the physical structure of the seafloor. The fossil record preserves these moments vividly, showing layers of broken coral skeletons interspersed with algae, microbial mats, and sediment, telling a story of both loss and replacement. Understanding the collapse of coral reefs is not just an academic exercise. It offers critical insights into the interplay between life and the environment over geological time. Coral reefs are sentinels of environmental change, sensitive indicators of shifts in temperature, chemistry, and ecological balance. By studying past collapses, scientists can better predict how modern reefs might respond to ongoing climate change, rising carbon dioxide levels, and other human-induced stresses. The lessons from millions of years ago are directly relevant to the challenges facing today's oceans, where warming seas, acidification, overfishing, and pollution threaten to trigger new collapses if conditions continue to worsen. The geological record also provides detailed evidence of the timing and scale of these collapses. Sedimentary layers often preserve abrupt shifts in reef composition, showing a sudden decline in coral abundance and diversity, followed by the proliferation of alternative organisms. These transitions can occur over thousands of years, a brief moment in geological time, but with effects lasting millions of years. Fossil assemblages reveal changes in species composition, with once-dominant corals disappearing and more resilient species filling the gaps. In some cases, entire reef provinces vanished from the oceans for millions of years, only to be repopulated when environmental conditions stabilized. It is also fascinating to consider the evolutionary consequences of reef collapse. When coral reefs disappear, selective pressures change dramatically. Species that depended on the intricate architecture of coral frameworks may go extinct, while others that could survive in simpler or more open habitats flourish. This process reshapes the evolutionary trajectory of marine life, influencing which groups dominate in subsequent eras. In some ways, the collapse of coral reefs acts as a reset button for marine ecosystems, wiping the slate clean and creating opportunities for new forms of life to evolve. The replacement of coral reefs is not uniform. It varies with geography, ocean chemistry, and climate. In some regions, algae take over, forming extensive mats that cover the seafloor. In others, sponges or microbialites dominate, building structures that, while less complex than coral reefs, still provide habitat for smaller organisms. Over time, as environmental conditions stabilize and seas become more hospitable, corals may return, but the new reef may differ significantly from the one that collapsed. The cycle of collapse and recovery has played out multiple times throughout Earth's history, each time leaving distinct marks in the geological record that scientists can read to understand past environmental crises. Coral reef collapse also highlights the interconnectedness of Earth's systems. Changes in the atmosphere, such as increased greenhouse gases from volcanic eruptions or other sources, affect ocean temperature and chemistry, which in turn influence reef growth and survival. Biological interactions, including competition and predation, further modify the response of reefs to stress. The collapse is rarely the result of a single factor. It emerges from the combination of environmental pressures, ecological interactions, and sometimes catastrophic events. Each collapse is therefore a complex story, written not in words but in stone, coral skeletons, and fossilized algae. Reefs, built painstakingly by corals, provided shelter, food, and breeding grounds for a vast array of marine life, but they were highly sensitive to changes in temperature, ocean chemistry, and ecological balance. When these conditions shifted, whether due to volcanic eruptions, climate change, ocean acidification, or biological competition, reefs crumbled, and the spaces they occupied were often taken over by algae, microbes, and other calcifying organisms. These replacements created new ecosystems, simpler in structure and less diverse, but still capable of supporting life. The geological record preserves these collapses in remarkable detail, offering snapshots of oceans in transition and providing insights into the forces that can drive entire ecosystems to the brink. Fossil layers show abrupt changes in coral abundance, the rise of alternative organisms, and the long-lasting impacts on marine biodiversity and ecosystem structure. By studying these ancient events, scientists gain a clearer understanding of the resilience and fragility of coral reefs, the cascading effects of environmental change, and the ways in which life adapts to survive. Before the Carnian Pluvial Event, during the earlier part of the late Triassic, The world's climate was generally warm and relatively dry. Pangaea, the vast supercontinent, stretched across much of the globe, and the interior regions were often arid, with deserts and seasonal drylands dominating large areas. Vegetation was adapted to these conditions. Gymnosperms, including conifers and cycads, formed the backbone of terrestrial flora, while ferns and horsetails occupied wetter lowlands, riverbanks, and floodplains. Forests existed but were unevenly distributed, and many regions of the continent remained sparsely vegetated due to prolonged dry conditions. Seed plants, with their drought-resistant adaptations, dominated upland areas, while lowland swampy regions still supported more primitive, moisture-loving plants. Then, around 233 million years ago, the Carnian Pluvial Event brought a sudden and dramatic shift. For roughly 2 million years, the Earth experienced exceptionally high rainfall, intense storms, and a marked increase in humidity across many regions of Pangaea. Rivers swelled, floodplains expanded, and large areas that had once been dry deserts became verdant landscapes. This rapid shift in climate had a profound impact on plant life. Areas that had previously been dominated by sparse gymnosperm forests suddenly became fertile grounds for the spread of ferns, horsetails, and newly emerging plant groups. The increase in water availability allowed plants to colonize regions that had been inhospitable for millions of years, promoting the expansion of lush vegetation in both lowland and upland areas. The Carnian Pluvial Event also accelerated the diversification of plant life. Ferns, which had been present for hundreds of millions of years, thrived under the humid conditions. Their spores could now travel farther in the moist air, enabling them to colonize new territories. Seed ferns, which had already evolved the ability to reproduce without relying directly on water, expanded into areas that had previously been marginal habitats. Gymnosperms adapted to drier conditions were temporarily outcompeted in regions where rainfall was abundant, while plants that could exploit wet soils gained a major advantage. This reshuffling of vegetation laid the foundation for the complex and varied forests that would emerge in the later Triassic and Jurassic periods. One of the most striking consequences of the Carnian Pluvial Event was the transformation of lowland ecosystems. Vast floodplains developed where seasonal rivers had previously dried up. These floodplains were quickly colonized by ferns, horsetails, and lycophytes, creating dense undergrowth and forming the first truly continuous, lush forest floors in some regions. The increased rainfall also allowed forests to develop multi-layered structures. Towering conifers formed canopies, seed ferns and cycads occupied the mid-level understory, and ferns and small plants carpeted the forest floor. This structural complexity provided habitats for a wide range of animals, from early amphibians to emerging reptiles and even the first dinosaurs, which were beginning to appear in small numbers during this time. In essence, the Carnian Pluvial Event allowed plants to reshape not just the landscape, but the entire terrestrial ecosystem. The event also influenced plant evolution at a more fundamental level. The prolonged period of humidity and consistent rainfall acted as a selective pressure, favoring plants that could take advantage of abundant water, reproduce rapidly, and spread efficiently. Spore-producing plants, such as ferns and lycophytes, flourished, while seed plants began to experiment with new strategies for reproduction, including more efficient dispersal of seeds in wet conditions. Some of the earliest ancestors of modern conifers diversified during this period, showing adaptations to both wet lowlands and drier uplands. The event essentially acted as an evolutionary reset, reshuffling plant communities, creating new ecological niches and stimulating the rise of new forms that would dominate for millions of years. Fossil evidence from the Carnian Pluvial Event vividly illustrates these changes. Sedimentary deposits from this period often show alternating layers of clay, silt, and sand, indicating repeated flooding and the formation of extensive wetlands. Preserved plant remains, including leaves, stems, and reproductive structures, reveal a sudden increase in fern and horsetail abundance. In some regions, petrified forests show dense stands of conifers interspersed with seed ferns, while coal-like deposits indicate the accumulation of vast amounts of plant material in swampy lowlands. These fossils confirm that the Carnian Pluvial Event was not just a brief anomaly, but a period of dramatic and sustained ecological transformation. Beyond reshaping landscapes and plant communities, the Carnian Pluvial Event had a lasting impact on global ecosystems. The proliferation of lush forests increased the amount of organic matter entering rivers, lakes, and the ocean, influencing nutrient cycles and supporting the evolution of aquatic life. The dense vegetation helped stabilize soils, reducing erosion in some areas while promoting sediment deposition in others. By increasing plant cover and transpiration, forests also influenced local and regional climates, potentially enhancing rainfall in certain regions and creating feedback loops that further encouraged forest expansion. In this way, the Carnian Pluvial Event illustrates how climate, plants, and ecosystems are deeply interconnected. A change in rainfall patterns can ripple through the environment, triggering evolutionary and ecological responses across multiple levels. The expansion of forests during the Carnian Pluvial Event also had implications for the future trajectory of life on Earth. With more diverse and productive plant communities, ecosystems became capable of supporting a greater variety of animals. Invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, and the earliest dinosaurs all benefited from the increased availability of food, shelter, and microhabitats. In particular, herbivorous dinosaurs found abundant vegetation to feed on, facilitating their later rise to ecological dominance during the Jurassic. The expansion of forests also helped sequester carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, influencing climate regulation over millions of years. In this sense, the Carnian Pluvial Event can be seen as a turning point, linking plant evolution, forest expansion, and the broader trajectory of terrestrial life. Interestingly, the Carnian Pluvial Event also illustrates the resilience of plant life. While some plant groups declined in the face of changing conditions, many others adapted, diversified, and spread into new habitats. This adaptability highlights a key theme in plant evolution: the ability to respond to environmental change. From the earliest land plants that clung to damp soils to the towering conifers and seed ferns of the Triassic, plants have continually evolved in response to challenges, and the Carnian Pluvial Event is a vivid example of how climate can drive evolutionary innovation. In the aftermath of the Carnian Pluvial Event, landscapes remained wetter than they had been for millions of years. Floodplains, river valleys, and coastal lowlands retained much of the lush vegetation established during the pluvial episode. Seed plants, including early conifers, became increasingly dominant in upland areas, while spore-producing plants maintained their strong presence in wetter regions. The restructuring of plant communities set the stage for the rise of true forests across Pangaea, which would persist into the Jurassic period. By the time the climate stabilized, forests were more complex, more diverse, and more widespread than ever before, demonstrating the long-lasting impact of this brief but intense episode of extreme rainfall. Rivers have always been some of the most powerful forces shaping the surface of our planet, carving valleys, moving soil and rocks, and shaping landscapes in ways that can take millions of years to fully unfold. Over time, the paths rivers take, the way they flow, and the land around them can change dramatically, driven by a combination of natural forces such as rainfall, floods, erosion, tectonic activity, and even the shifting of climate. The history of river systems is, in essence, a history of transformation, a story of constant movement, destruction, and creation, where old features disappear and new ones emerge in their place. Flooding has been one of the most dramatic forces in shaping river systems and the landscapes through which they flow. Floods occur when rivers carry more water than their banks can hold, often after periods of intense rainfall or snowmelt. These events can be sudden and devastating, sweeping away soil, vegetation, and even human settlements. But floods are also an essential part of the natural cycle of rivers. They redistribute nutrients across floodplains, carry sediment downstream, and help create new landforms. The sediment carried by floodwaters is often fine clay, silt, or sand, which can settle in layers when the water slows down. Over long periods, these deposits build up to form fertile plains and deltas, areas of land that are among the richest and most productive on Earth. In regions that experience regular flooding, such as along the Nile River in Egypt, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, or the Mississippi River in North America, civilizations have flourished for thousands of years because of the natural fertilization provided by river floods. Erosion is another key process in the evolution of river landscapes. Erosion happens when the moving water of a river wears away the land it passes over. This can happen in many ways. Water can slowly dissolve certain types of rocks, or it can physically carry small particles like sand and pebbles, grinding away the riverbed and the banks over time. Erosion can be gentle and gradual, taking thousands or millions of years to noticeably reshape a landscape, or it can be sudden and dramatic, triggered by powerful floods or landslides. The results of erosion are visible everywhere in nature, from the deep canyons carved by rivers such as the Colorado in North America to the smooth river valleys found in Europe and Asia. The force of water combined with the particles it carries acts like a natural sandpaper, slowly but inexorably reshaping the land. In addition to floods and erosion, rivers also create entirely new landforms. As water flows, it carries sediments, which it can deposit when the river slows down. Over time, these deposits can form sandbars, islands, and new deltas, where rivers meet larger bodies of water such as lakes or oceans. For example, the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers in South Asia carry enormous amounts of sediment from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal, building one of the largest and most fertile deltas in the world. These landforms are constantly changing, with new channels opening, islands appearing, and older areas eroding away. The movement of rivers and the creation of new landforms is a dynamic, never-ending process, one that has shaped the Earth's surface for hundreds of millions of years. Rivers do not exist in isolation. They interact closely with the surrounding landscapes, which also change over time. In mountainous regions, rivers often have steep gradients and fast currents, cutting deep valleys and gorges as they flow. In flat plains, rivers move more slowly, meandering across the land and creating wide floodplains. The way rivers shape landscapes is influenced by the geology of the area, including the types of rocks and soils present, as well as by climate, which affects the amount of water available to rivers. During periods of heavy rainfall or warming climates, rivers can become much larger and more energetic, leading to increased erosion and sediment transport. In contrast, during dry periods, rivers may shrink or even dry up entirely, leaving behind ancient riverbeds that mark the path of waterways long gone. One of the most fascinating aspects of river evolution is how rivers can change course over time. This can happen gradually as sediment builds up along one bank and forces the river to slowly bend and curve, or suddenly, as in the case of a major flood that breaks through the banks and carves a new channel. These changes can have dramatic effects on the surrounding landscape, creating oxbow lakes, abandoned river channels, and new floodplains. Over centuries and millennia, the shifting paths of rivers have dramatically altered the appearance of continents, rearranging forests, wetlands, and human settlements. Archaeological studies show that ancient civilizations often had to adapt to these changing river courses, sometimes moving entire settlements when a river shifted away from its original path. The impact of rivers on landscapes is also evident in the formation of valleys, canyons, and gorges. Rivers slowly cut down into bedrock, deepening their channels over time. In some cases, they can create astonishingly deep and narrow gorges with steep walls that reveal layers of rock formed over millions of years. The Grand Canyon in North America, for example, exposes nearly 2 billion years of geological history in its cliffs and walls, all carved by the relentless power of the Colorado River. In other areas, rivers erode wide valleys, leaving gently sloping sides and broad floodplains. The combination of erosion and sediment deposition shapes the land in complex patterns, producing the diverse and beautiful river landscapes we see across the globe. Rivers can also interact with tectonic forces and the movement of the Earth's crust. Uplift of mountains or sinking of land can dramatically change the flow of rivers, causing them to cut deeper into the land or divert their paths entirely. In areas where tectonic activity is intense, rivers can carve dramatic canyons and gorges as the land rises beneath them. In other regions, subsidence can cause rivers to spread out and form wide deltas or marshy wetlands. These interactions between rivers and tectonics demonstrate how landscapes are shaped not only by the water itself, but also by the movements of the Earth over geological time. Another factor influencing river systems and landscapes is climate change, both past and present. During periods of global warming, melting glaciers and increased rainfall can swell rivers and intensify flooding and erosion. During cooler periods or ice ages, rivers may shrink or become frozen, reducing their ability to transport sediment. These climatic shifts leave clear marks in the geological record, such as layers of sediment in river valleys, terraces along riverbanks, and ancient floodplains far from present-day rivers. By studying these features, scientists can reconstruct the history of river systems and understand how landscapes have responded to changing climates over millions of years. Human activity has also become an important factor in shaping rivers and landscapes, especially over the last few thousand years. Dams, levees, and irrigation systems have altered the natural flow of rivers, reducing flooding in some areas while increasing erosion in others. Urbanization and deforestation can increase runoff, causing rivers to carry more sediment and change course more rapidly. Mining and agriculture can also contribute to erosion and sediment deposition, reshaping river valleys and floodplains. While humans can control certain aspects of rivers, the natural forces of water, sediment, and erosion continue to operate, often in ways that are difficult to predict or manage. The formation of new land by rivers is a process that is both slow and constant. As rivers carry sediment downstream, they deposit it in areas where the water slows, such as in bends, behind obstacles, or at river mouths. Over time, these deposits accumulate, creating new landforms that can support vegetation and wildlife. Floodplains, river terraces, and deltas are all examples of land created by the interaction of water and sediment. In some cases, these areas can grow large enough to support human settlements and agriculture, as seen in the fertile plains of the Nile, the Indus, and the Mekong rivers. The ongoing creation of land by rivers demonstrates the enduring power of water to shape the earth and support life. Rivers also create unique ecosystems that depend on the dynamic nature of water and sediment. Floodplains, wetlands, and riverbanks host a wide variety of plants and animals adapted to the changing environment. Periodic flooding brings nutrients and creates habitats for fish, birds, and mammals, while erosion exposes new surfaces for colonization by plants and microorganisms. These ecosystems are constantly evolving as rivers shift their channels, deposit sediment, and reshape the land. In this way, the movement of rivers not only changes the physical landscape, but also supports a living landscape, teeming with life and diversity.